Welcome to Lost at 3 a.m. Put your phone down, close your eyes, and let this be the last video you hear tonight. Just breathe, settle in, and let's begin. Before the portal gun, before Pickle Rick, Evil Morty, and the infinite timelines, before the talking cats, exploding planets, and awkward Thanksgiving dinners, Rick and Morty was just an idea, a weird animated show about a mad scientist and his nervous grandson, bouncing between realities and wrecking everything in their path. But as the episodes kept coming, it turned out to be a little more than that. A lot more, actually. Beneath the chaos and the crude jokes, Rick and Morty became something deeper, a story about loneliness, identity, regret, and the strange, painful ways people try to connect. It's about a guy who can build anything except a functioning relationship, a kid who sees too much but can't look away, and a family that's barely holding together across dinner tables and dimensional rifts. Tonight, we're jumping into that world. We'll talk about where the show came from, why it hits harder than it probably should, and the small, surprising moments of meaning buried under all the madness. So close your eyes. Picture a garage, a flask, a green portal humming in the background. This is Rick and Morty, and this is where it starts. Before it was a show with Emmy wins, merch in every mall, and catchphrases on bumper stickers, Rick and Morty started as something much smaller, much stranger. In 2006, Justin Roiland made a bizarre, crude little animated short called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty. It was a parody of Back to the Future, and it was not exactly subtle. It was messy, intentionally offensive, and absolutely not something you'd expect to turn into a global franchise. But that short caught the eye of Dan Harmon, the creator of Community, and something about it stuck. Harmon and Roiland started talking, and somewhere between the absurdity and the shock humor, they realized there was potential, a chance to take that chaotic energy and build a real story around it. Not just gags, not just sci-fi references, but a world. A dysfunctional family, and a scientist with every answer in the universe, except how to be a decent person. Adult Swim gave them the green light. The first episode aired in 2013, and almost immediately, people noticed. It was weird, it was dark, it was smart in a way that didn't feel forced, but more than anything, it was different. It didn't hold your hand, it didn't care if you were uncomfortable, and it definitely didn't care about happy endings. The pilot introduced the formula. Rick and Morty go on a sci-fi adventure. Things get out of hand. Morty panics. Rick burps. Chaos ensues. But under all of it, there was something else. A quiet, creeping sense that this wasn't just about space bugs and laser guns. There was sadness in it. There was something broken underneath the noise. The show wasn't trying to make Rick likable. That was never the point. It made him compelling, complicated. Morty, too. He wasn't just the sidekick. He was the human cost of Rick's genius. The one who had to remember the bodies, the trauma, the alternate versions of himself left behind. And as more episodes aired, it became clear. Rick and Morty was doing something most animated comedies didn't. It wasn't just making fun of sci-fi tropes. It was using them to talk about bigger things. About meaning, about mental health, about how it feels to live in a world that keeps spinning, even when you don't know why you're still in it. It started as a parody, a joke, but like all good sci-fi, it found truth in the absurd, and people connected to that in a big, unexpected way. At the center of Rick and Morty is a very simple idea, a genius and his grandson going on adventures. But the more you watch, the more you realize it's not really about the sci-fi. It's about the people, or in this case, the deeply broken people trying to hold a family together across infinite timelines. There's Rick Sanchez, a man who can invent anything, escape any situation, and ruin just about everything he touches. He's the smartest man in the universe, and he's miserable. The drinking, the arrogance, the way he drags his family into constant danger, it's all part of the same thing. Rick knows too much about the universe, about himself, and the more he knows, the harder it is for him to care about anything. But then there's Morty, nervous, sweaty, in over his head since episode 1. At first, Morty feels like a classic sidekick, there for comic relief and moral contrast. But as the seasons go on, he changes. He starts to push back, to question Rick. He gets darker, smarter, sadder. You start to realize he's not just along for the ride, he's becoming someone else entirely. Someone shaped by the choices Rick keeps making. And then there's Summer, the older sister who started off mostly in the background, only to quietly become one of the show's most capable characters. She doesn't get overwhelmed by Rick's chaos. Instead, she learns to work with it, to stand on her own. She's sharp, sarcastic, and probably the most adaptable person in the family. Beth, their mother, is more complicated. She's a horse surgeon. She drinks a little too much, and she's constantly trying to reconcile her intellect with the fact that her father abandoned her, came back, and brought a multiverse of emotional baggage with him. Sometimes she feels hollow. Sometimes she feels terrifyingly capable. And sometimes she might not even be the original version of herself. And the show doesn't really clarify if that matters. And then there's Jerry, the dad, the outlier, the one who never quite fits into any of it. Jerry is insecure, overly sensitive, and painfully average. But he's also kind, consistent, the one person who seems to genuinely care, even when no one else does. In a family of collapsing identities, Jerry stays exactly the same, and somehow that ends up being one of the show's most reliable emotional threads. Together, they don't make a perfect family, not even close. But that's kind of the point. Rick and Morty isn't about solving everything. It's about what it looks like when people keep trying, even when nothing makes sense, even when it hurts. Because in a show filled with clones, alternate realities, and alien dictatorships, the thing that stays the most human is them. Flawed, funny, broken, and still trying to understand each other. One of the first things you learn watching Rick and Morty is that nothing is fixed, not even reality. In this universe, or rather, in every universe, there's a version of everything. A version where Rick turned himself into a pickle. A version where Jerry is president. A version where Cronenberg monsters rule the suburbs. And a version where the family you've been following for seasons might not even be the original one. The multiverse isn't just a backdrop in Rick and Morty, it's the structure. It's the reason actions have weight and no weight at the same time. You can blow up the Earth and still be home in time for dinner, as long as you jump to another version of yourself that didn't. It sounds ridiculous, and it is, but it's also kind of brilliant. Because by setting the show in a world where anything can happen, where every choice leads to a new timeline, the writers aren't just playing with sci-fi. They're holding up a mirror. The multiverse lets the show ask questions most comedies never go near. Like, what happens when you don't have to live with consequences? What does identity even mean if there are endless versions of you out there making different choices? And if nothing is permanent, why should we care about anything at all? It's a terrifying idea, and the show leans into it. Rick talks constantly about how meaningless everything is, that nothing matters, that love, morality, even family are just illusions in an infinite cosmos. But then, he keeps showing up. He keeps helping Morty. He keeps going back to that garage. Because even in a world where everything is replaceable, some things aren't. And Rick and Morty lives in that contradiction. It's not trying to explain the multiverse. It's using it to explore something else. How fragile we really are. How small we feel when the world opens up too wide. And how sometimes the only thing that keeps us grounded is the version of us that still shows up for someone else. So yeah, it's absurd. It's messy. But underneath the infinite versions of everything, there's one truth the show keeps circling back to. If nothing matters, then maybe the only meaning is the meaning you make. At first glance, Rick and Morty might seem like it's just throwing around big sciencey words for the sake of the joke. Wormholes, parallel dimensions, quantum theory, It all sounds like gibberish when Rick's slurring his way through an explanation while holding a flask. But if you listen a little closer, some of it's not just technobabble. A surprising amount of it is rooted in real science. Take multiverse theory. That's a genuine idea in physics, the notion that there could be infinite parallel realities, each branching off from different choices, different outcomes. It's not exactly settled science, but it's serious enough that actual physicists debate it. And Rick and Morty leans all the way in, taking that theory and stretching it to the weirdest, darkest, and funniest places imaginable. Or look at simulation theory, the idea that we could all be living inside some kind of hyper-advanced computer program. The show doesn't just mention it, it builds entire episodes around it. Real layers of simulated realities, stacked inside each other, complete with fake people who don't know they're fake. The science gets twisted, exaggerated, played for laughs, but the core concept is still there. Even things like time dilation, string theory, genetic engineering, or AI consciousness, they all make appearances. Not always accurate, not always respectful of the laws of physics, but always used in a way that makes the story feel bigger, stranger, and just close enough to real to get under your skin. Because that's the trick. The show doesn't try to be scientifically accurate, it tries to feel plausible. Just enough real-world science to make you wonder, what if? What if wormholes were portable? What if we could edit DNA like a playlist? What if a toaster could have emotions? And Rick, of course, is the vehicle for all of it. A character who understands the universe so well that none of it surprises him anymore. He doesn't just bend the laws of nature, he breaks them, rewrites them, mocks them, and then uses them to win an argument at the dinner table. But the point isn't the science itself, it's what the science reveals about the characters. Rick's inventions aren't just clever, they're coping mechanisms, tools he uses to avoid feelings, to escape pain, to control a world he otherwise can't. In Rick and Morty, science is never just about the science. It's about power, about control, about how knowledge, when pushed to its extreme, can either expand your world or completely unravel it. And in the end, even the smartest man in the universe still can't invent his way out of being human. It's easy to watch Rick and Morty and get caught up in the jokes, the wild inventions, the over-the-top violence, the absurd plot twists that go nowhere on purpose. But if you sit with it a little longer, something heavier starts to surface. This show is sad. Not all the time, not always in the way you'd expect, but it's there, quietly sitting underneath the chaos, because Rick and Morty isn't just a sci-fi comedy. It's also a story about people who are deeply, painfully lost. At the center of it is Rick, a man who can do anything, go anywhere, and still wakes up every day with nothing to look forward to. He's the smartest person in every room, and it doesn't make him happy. It makes him numb, detached, angry. He drinks constantly. He isolates himself. He ruins every connection he has, sometimes on purpose, sometimes just because he doesn't know how to stop. And the show never really makes excuses for him. It just shows you what that kind of emptiness looks like. Morty, meanwhile, gets dragged through the emotional fallout. What started as a kid going on sci-fi adventures with his grandpa slowly turns into something darker. Morty becomes more cynical, more reckless. You start to see what it does to a person when they're exposed to too much violence, too many impossible choices, too many versions of themselves dying over and over again. And the rest of the family, they're not okay either. Beth is constantly stuck between resentment and dependency. Summer tries to act like none of it bothers her, even when it clearly does. And Jerry, for all his flaws, is often the only one who's honest about how scared he is. The show doesn't hit you with big emotional speeches. It sneaks it in through throwaway lines, quiet moments, the look on Rick's face after everyone else leaves the room, the way Morty pauses before going through another portal, the fact that sometimes they don't joke at all, they just sit in it. Rick and Morty plays with nihilism a lot, the idea that nothing matters, that the universe is indifferent, that no one's really in control. But it never fully leans into that emptiness. Instead, it asks, what do you do when you believe that? How do you keep going when you don't think there's a point? And the answer, more often than not, is you still show up, you still come home, you still care, even if you don't know why. The show is never preachy. It doesn't try to fix these characters, it just shows them as they are, hurt, flawed, trying, sometimes failing, but still there. Because beneath the science and the satire, Rick and Morty is, at its core, a story about damage and what it looks like to live with it. By this point in the series, you've probably noticed Rick and Morty doesn't like playing by the rules. It doesn't just mess with timelines and character arcs, it breaks its own format, constantly, on purpose. This is a show that knows it's a show, and it uses that to its advantage. From the very beginning, there were hints, Rick glancing at the camera, lines like, "That's season 1, baby," or "See you in another 6 seasons." At first, it feels like a joke, just more absurdity layered on top of absurdity. But over time, it becomes something more deliberate. Rick and Morty doesn't just break the fourth wall, it lives there. And nowhere is that clearer than in episodes like Never Ricking Morty, the one that takes place on a literal story train. It's a full episode about how stories work, how characters grow, and how predictable narrative arcs can be manipulated, rejected, or blown up entirely. The show spends an entire half hour arguing with itself about storytelling, and somehow still makes it funny. Then there's Mr. Poopy Butthole, a character who started as a punchline and became a kind of meta-narrator. He pops in and out of episodes, not just to make jokes, but to quietly comment on how time passes, how trauma lingers, how shows evolve. It's subtle, strange, and unexpectedly emotional. And of course, Evil Morty, one of the show's most fascinating long-term arcs, is entirely built on subverting what we expect from the main characters. He takes the multiverse, the citadel, the idea of Ricks and Mortys being eternally paired, and burns it all down. It's not just a twist, it's the show tearing up its own blueprint and asking what comes next. Even the structure of individual episodes plays with format. Some are anthology style, some are fake clip shows, some loop back on themselves or end in places that feel abrupt or unresolved. And that's the point. Rick and Morty doesn't always want to satisfy you. It wants to surprise you, or confuse you, or leave you with something that doesn't quite sit right. But beneath all the meta-commentary, the message is actually pretty simple. Even the smartest, most self-aware characters can't escape the emotional stuff. You can point out every trope, break every rule, shatter every fourth wall, but at the end of the day, you still have to live with your choices. The show isn't just clever for the sake of being clever. It's using all these tricks to pull you in deeper, to make you question what's real, what matters, and whether or not breaking the rules actually sets you free, or just leaves you more lost than before. Because even when Rick and Morty is making fun of itself, it's still telling you something real. It just doesn't need a monologue to say it. If you ever need proof that Rick and Morty hit bigger than anyone expected, just look at the Szechuan sauce. It started as a throwaway joke. In the season 3 premiere, Rick rants about a limited edition McDonald's dipping sauce that came out back in 1998 to promote Mulan. It was weird, it was funny, and most people assumed that was the end of it. But then the internet did what it does best. Fans latched onto the line, memes exploded, bottles of the sauce started going for hundreds of dollars on eBay, and eventually McDonald's brought it back, for one day, in limited quantities. People lined up around the block, stores ran out in minutes, and in some places, things got ugly. There were chants, protests, even police called to manage the crowd, all over a sauce. It was absurd, but also kind of revealing. Rick and Morty isn't just a TV show, it's a cultural phenomenon, and the fan base, intense, doesn't quite cover it. Some of it's great, The creativity, the fan theories, the artwork, the hours spent dissecting timelines and alternate versions of Rick. Fans have built this incredible ecosystem around the show, trying to crack its codes and connect the dots. It's become almost like a puzzle, something you don't just watch, but study. But not all of the fandom has been positive. At times, the enthusiasm has tipped into entitlement. When Season 3 came out after a long delay, some fans turned toxic, harassing the show's writers online, demanding new episodes, acting like they were owed something. It got loud and ugly. Even Rick and Morty has joked about this, poking fun at fans who claim you have to be smart to get it, as if the show's complexity makes it exclusive. But the truth is, the show was never trying to be a litmus test for intelligence. It's smart, yes, but it's also messy, emotional, and deeply human. It's about broken people trying to make sense of a universe that doesn't care how clever you are. And maybe that's the irony. A show about nihilism and chaos ends up with a fan base desperate to find order, to decode the meaning, to win at something that was never a competition. Still, the passion behind it all is real. Because at the end of the day, Rick and Morty connects with people. It gives them something to hold on to, whether it's a joke, a character, or a glimpse of something that feels true underneath the absurdity. Even if that something is just a forgotten dipping sauce from the 90s. When Rick and Morty first aired, it felt like pure chaos. Sci-fi gags, gross-out humor, endless burps, and episodes that gleefully spiraled out of control. And for a while, that was the point. It was fast, clever, unpredictable, and loud. But over time, the show started to shift. It got slower in places, quieter. The characters began to feel less like cartoon archetypes and more like people, confused, insecure, changing in ways they didn't fully understand. The early seasons were about exploring the multiverse. The later ones started exploring something smaller, identity, regret, the fallout of everything that had come before. Rick, especially, began to unravel. The mask of indifference started to crack. Episodes like the Ricklantis mix-up or Rick Mirai Jack peeled him back layer by layer, showing not just his genius, but the damage behind it, his choices, his losses, his guilt. And it didn't always lead to growth, but that felt real. Sometimes people don't grow, they just keep going. Morty changed too. He became less wide-eyed and more jaded, less of a sidekick, more of a partner, sometimes even the one calling the shots. His arc is slower, subtler, but you can feel the weight of what he's been through. You can see how each season reshapes him. And then there's the show itself. The storytelling got more experimental, more serialized. Storylines started weaving through seasons, looping back around, making you rethink what you thought you knew. The jokes never went away, but they started landing differently. Less punchline, more commentary. There's still absurdity, still talking cats and space snakes and vat of acid episodes. But now there's also room for silence, for characters to sit with something uncomfortable, for moments that don't end with a laugh, but a pause. It's not that Rick and Morty stopped being funny, it's that it started asking bigger questions and letting those questions hang, not always with answers, not always with closure, but with honesty. And maybe that's the real evolution. A show that began by screaming, "Nothing matters," now quietly suggests that maybe something does. Not everything, not all the time, but just enough to keep showing up, just enough to keep watching. After all the portal jumps, all the sci-fi parodies, all the clones and cats and infinite timelines, Rick and Morty still works. And not because it's the smartest show in the room, or the weirdest, or the funniest, though sometimes it's all three. It works because underneath the madness, there's something real, something that keeps pulling people back. The show doesn't offer easy answers. It doesn't tie things up in neat little arcs. In fact, it avoids resolution almost on purpose. But every once in a while, in between the chaos, you get a glimpse of something honest. A look, a line, a moment where the characters stop running from themselves. And those moments hit harder than they should, because they're rare, because they feel earned. Rick and Morty isn't interested in being comforting. It's a show about meaninglessness that's somehow packed with meaning. It takes the biggest, most impossible ideas, free will, identity, death, purpose, and filters them through characters who are just trying. Failing, sure, but still trying. Rick pretends none of it matters, but if that were true, he wouldn't come back to the garage. He wouldn't fix the ship. He wouldn't save Morty, not again and again. Morty says he's over it, but he still looks up to Rick, still wants him to be better. Summer fights to be taken seriously. Beth tries to understand herself, and Jerry just keeps being Jerry. It works because it's absurd, and it works because it's sad. It works because it never picks a side between the two. It just sits somewhere in the middle, floating between nihilism and sincerity, asking, if the universe really is meaningless, what do we do with that? And the answer the show keeps circling back to is, you love your family, even when they're impossible. You keep showing up, even when it's easier not to. You make the joke, even when no one laughs. You try. That's what makes Rick and Morty more than just a sci-fi cartoon. That's what keeps it surprising, and maybe, in its own strange, broken way, that's what makes it human. Thanks for spending your night with Lost at 3 a.m.